But let's jump into the piebald. First off, I want to talk about the fact that really a picture of a piebald ball python is what drove me to really love ball pythons. I love ball pythons my whole life, don't get me wrong. But when I was like 15 years old, I worked at this pet shop, and there was a wholesaler called Great Lakes Zoological that we just a junk wholesaler, right? And the pet shop, because that was all it was, imports. I mean, there was nothing really, hardly anyone was captive producing anything.
Right.
So he had tokay geckos and this and that. And I remember one time, my boss allowed me to go there, and it was literally only about a mile away. But I was able, because I was the reptile guy. I took care of the reptiles there, and sure enough, he allowed me to go and pick out a shipment of reptiles, which was an honor for a 15-year-old kid. And I can't recall exactly what I bought from there, but nevertheless, he had a picture of a piebald ball python that was actually imported, I believe, in the 80s. To a guy named Brian Sharp, of course, Sharp albino boas.
Okay.
And Sharp had never, it didn't live, it didn't breed, he never produced it, so it was dead, But this picture was there, and I just remember being like blown away, And I always told people that, like, that was really, the thing that threw me into like, oh my God, that is the ball python. And I've said it to this day that if I were to choose one ball python morph that I love, it would still be the piebalds. And that probably goes back to that 15-year-old little Brian, that really just was infatuated with that picture. Fast forward quite a few years, and I guess, I'm going to say early 90s or something on that lines. And ironically enough, Brian Sharp imported another piebald. Same guy.
What luck?
Imported another piebald. And probably what it was is that he had bought the first one, and probably the same guy. I'm assuming it was probably Emmanuel Noah. Probably reached out to him because he knew he bought the first one, and so he sold him the second one, and it was a male. And then maybe a year or two later, a guy named Ernie Wagner, I've talked about him, a legend out in Seattle, bred the first Burmese pythons back in the 60s. He ended up importing an adult male as well. And then two baby females were born in a farm. This is when they just started farming over in Africa. And sure enough, Emmanuel Noah, whether he hatched them or someone hatched them and he got them, whatever happened, he ended up sending them to Dave and Tracy at VPI down in Texas. And Pete and Tracy were good friends because Tracy originally, before she was Tracy Barker, was Tracy Miller, and she came from the Baltimore area. Of course, Pete's in the Baltimore area. And so somehow Pete ended up, he wanted to get those animals. And what happened was actually Emmanuel Noah sent them to Tracy and Dave for free and said, you guys sell them for me and then give me money when you're done. And they basically said, no one would be interested in these. I mean, they're just, they're probably not genetic. It's probably an incubational thing, because that was the general consensus is the piebald ball pythons weren't going to be genetic.
Wow.
And so about 6 or 8 months went by, and I guess Noah kept trying to see if they were going to sell them, and they kept on telling him no one's interested. And I'm not going to get into their mindset, and I'm not accusing them of anything, but my understanding was coming from Pete was that they never tried to sell them, right? They just wanted to keep them, and so they just kept on saying, no one's interested in them. So Pete, interestingly enough, kind of backdoors him on the deal, goes to Noah, pays Noah like, I don't know, $15,000, $20,000 a piece for him, and flies to Texas, doesn't even tell Tracy, says, calls her up and says, hey, I'm in Texas, I'd like to come over. He goes over there and he says, oh, and by the way, I'm here to pick up the 2 female pies.
Oh, man, bro.
And he takes the pies and he brings them back home with them. Shortly thereafter, Brian Sharp, I think, had the adult male now, pied, the second one, for a year or two, and it just wouldn't breed for him.
Yeah.
So Pete buys that animal from him. So now Pete has 3 of the 4 pieds, right? The 2 females that are captive hatched now, about a year old, and then an adult male. Ernie still has the other male piebald that's in the wild. Ernie produces 2 clutches of, bred to a normal, and so they're potential heterozygous. And Ernie is trying to sell those for, I think he wanted to sell them for like $7,500 a pair for these potential heads. Nobody was interested because, again, the consensus was it probably wasn't even going to be genetic. So Pete ends up buying the male from Ernie. He buys it from Ernie, and then for whatever reason, he had it for a very short period of time, maybe a few months. And at that point, it was at the end of the breeding season. So I think he may have bred the male a little bit. And also, ironically enough, the male he bought from Brian bred that year. So Pete produced a number of clutches of hets. So at the end of the breeding season, Pete reaches out to me because everyone knows that I'm really interested in piebalds, and I was on the but I just wasn't ready to pull the trigger on a pair of hets when, they're normal looking ball pythons, and we just didn't know and stuff like that. So Pete calls me up and he says, hey, I'm going to sell the male I bought from Ernie that he had only had for 2 or 3 months. And he said, I want $15,000 for it. And again, not genetic, don't know what's going to happen. But I was so into it, I was like, I've got to do this. So this is, again, we're like, me and Lori are maybe 19 at the time, 20 at the most, something like that. And so I was breeding snakes and making a couple bucks, but didn't have that kind of money because I had put almost all my money that I kept on making right back into the business and stuff like that. So I end up literally going to Lori's dad and borrowing $10,000.
Jeez.
Literally, we had $5,000. He borrowed us $10,000. We send Pete the money. And I remember telling Pete, and this is, by the way, weirdly enough, Pete Call has kind of been out of the thing for a while. But weirdly enough, he called me last night. And unfortunately, it was like just normal, as Pete always does. He called me at like 12:30 at night. And I didn't get the call. And I saw this morning that I missed the call, and I am going to call Pete back. I haven't talked to Pete in probably a year, So it was really nice that he reached out to me. I can't wait to talk to him. So this is by no means like a bad story about Pete. Me and Pete are very good friends, and I have the utmost respect for him. But so anyways, when I'm buying the snake, obviously I'm borrowing $10,000. It's a big deal. And I was nervous, you know what I mean? So I it was the biggest single investment snake I had bought to this point, and so I remember saying, well, Pete, I'm really nervous. What do I do? What if the snake doesn't make it? What blah, 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 blah. And he's like, oh, Brian, you're fine. He goes, listen, Brian, no matter what happens, I'm going to take care of you. It's don't worry about it. It's a healthy snake. It looks great. You're going to do fine with it. I'm like, all right. So I send him the money. Again, this is before the internet. This is before FedEx would FedEx you something. So he actually has someone that's going to the Columbus, Ohio reptile show. And I did that every month, right? So his friend meets me at Columbus after I've sent him the money. I get the box, I open it up. Immediately when I pull it out, it's a beautiful snake. It's a big adult male, but it's like really, really light. So it's a snake that should weigh 1,200 grams, probably weighs 600 grams,
Okay.
And it doesn't look skinny. It looks okay. It just is like hollow, right? It's like this hollowy feel, right? And so I get home that night because there's no cell phones at the time. I get home that night and I call Pete up and I'm like, hey, dude, I'm just a little worried. The snake it moves a little weird. It's a little bit weird. And he's like, Brian, you're stressing out. Just don't worry about it. You're fine. All right, cool. And so a couple days go by after I settle in. I throw a mouse in there, crushes a mouse. And I'm like, oh, thank God. It's so good. This is great news.
Yeah.
Crushes a mouse. But it was like, I've never, even to this day since then, I've never heard this before. When you would hold it, you would hear like crackling noise.
Weird,
almost like
dude.
it's
Vertebrae
ribs.
were weird.
Yeah, it's like his ribs would crackle, like it had arthritis or something. Really weird, right? And so now about a week goes by and I'm just tripping out. It ate one time, it refuses a second time. It only ate a mouse, and this is a big adult animal. Didn't eat a rat, ate a mouse. And I'm stressing out, and so I call Pete up and I'm like, Pete, I'm really nervous, man. This snake makes this weird noise. Never heard this before, and it's weird that all these years later I've never heard it since. From any other snake. And he's like, you're stressing out, blah, blah. He goes, if you want, just send the snake back. I'll give your money back. And I'm like, well, no, Pete, seriously, I don't want to send the snake back. I just want to keep you informed that I'm a little concerned about it because I've never seen a snake do the things it's doing. And then he's like, oh, no, you're fine. Don't stress out. You're good. I'm like, all right, cool. Like 3 days later, I'll never forget. And this is when I kept all my snakes in the basement of, we had bought our first house at this point. So we were 20 because I remember we bought our house when we were 20. All our snakes were in our basement. And every morning, whatever, early in the morning, I would go downstairs and check on all our snakes, obviously first thing I would do in the morning. And, I go down there and of course the first snake I'm going to check on is this new piebald ball python.
Yeah.
And I just start to open the drawer. It's in a drawer. And, and it's on newspaper, and there's blood all over the newspaper. Blood all over the newspaper, and the snake is dead. Now, I've had it literally like 10, 12 days, you know, and it's dead. And so I'm obviously just beside myself, you know, like, what the hell? So I call Pete like 25 times. I mean, you know, it's one, I hate to say it, but I was one of those guys that just like called.
Yeah.
He finally calls me back, and he's like, what the, and now he's like upset at me or something like that.
For
like
blowing
what
up.
the F, you know, what did you do to it? And I'm like, dude, I didn't do anything. So he's like, well, you need to get a necropsy on it. And he goes, okay. And there's a guy named Elliot Jacobson that did most of the work. He was the, I believe he's the director of veterinary science down at the University of Florida. Very famous veterinarian anyways. He did all of the work on inclusion body disease, IBD. And so him and Pete were friends because, of course, Pete had dealt with IBD. As a matter of fact, right around the time that this thing happened, Pete was just kind of getting over his IBD issue, where it wiped out a big portion, almost all of his boas. And of course, it didn't hit his ball pythons. And that was the initial thought, was, is there a chance that this could be IBD and this PIED? So I send the animal down for a necropsy to Elliot Jacobson. And about a week goes by. Elliot gets, you know, after does the pathology on it and the necropsy, he comes back, and what it was is there was a cancerous cyst in its lung.
Yeah.
Now, Pete could have never known that. I certainly could never have known that. And this cancerous cyst erupted, burst, and it actually asphyxiated itself on its own blood.
Yeah, like drowned,
Yeah, drowned in its own blood, and that's why there was blood all over the cage. And this is not Pete's fault. It's not my fault. It happened, So obviously, I'm going back to this, Brian, whatever happens, I'm going to make it right type of thing, right? And so I called Pete up. And again, I'm not, listen, I love Pete. We've been friends ever since, and I think the world of him. But I called him up, and he said, hey, I gave you a chance to send it back. You chose not to. That null and void the guarantee.
Damn.
And so I ate $15,000, which $10,000 wasn't even mine. So interestingly enough, Ernie Wagner, God bless him, heard about the animal dying. And he called me up out of nowhere, and I had only talked to Ernie maybe 10 times. He's probably still one of those guys that like I get nervous about talking.
Yeah,
because he's like that much of a legend, just a super good guy. And I know he's still alive. I don't know where he's got to be. I mean, he's got to be in his like mid to late 80s, I believe, by now. So I don't know what faculties he has or anything like that. But nevertheless, he calls me up, and he was like, beatnik.
Yeah.
He was like a beatnik guy, always kind of like groovy dude, and like really, it's just had this really
Motowny.
Just a really cool feel to him, and he calls me up. He's like, Brian, man, I heard what happened, man. I feel so bad for you, what, and he's like, listen, this is what I want to offer you. He goes, if you want a pair of these hats that were fathered by this male, I'll sell them to you for $2,500 instead of $7,500. And so I remember going to Lori, and you can only imagine this conversation, right? We just lost, $15,000 in 12 days or whatever it was, and I'm like, this is our deal. We can spend $2,500. We don't know if it's genetic. These could be a pair of normal ball pythons.
Yeah.
Or we could spend $2,500, and if it is genetic, we could make our money back. So it's either let's lose the $15,000 and walk away from it, or let's roll the dice on another.
On 17.5.
Let's double down, and not double, but seven. Now we're risking 17.5, but we could make our money back. So she immediately agreed. She said, I think we should go for it. Let's buy the pair of hats. So we bought the pair of hats. They were babies. The following year, Pete had one of the females from I think both of the females from Tracy were up to size, and he produced PIED to PIED. I think maybe 2 clutches. I'm not even sure. And the rumors, I don't know if this is true or not. The rumor is that he was so excited to see if it was genetic. At day like 40, he cut one of the eggs.
No.
And sure enough, there was a PIED in there. And I heard that that baby died because he cut it so early. Again, I don't know if that's true. That was just the rumor. But he proved it to be genetic. And then, of course, the rest of the clutch hatched 20 days later. And I think he had 2 clutches, if I'm not mistaken. So I think he produced 2 clutches of pied that year. And that was like really what made ball pythons explode, to be totally honest with you, is that he offered those for $25,000. And much like what happened with the albino Burmese pythons with Bob Clark, when it was like the first investment big snake.
Yeah.
This was the first really big investment ball python at $25,000. And so now I knew I had a pair of hets that were a year old, and hets now went from $7,500 that no one wanted to $25,000, and Pete sold every single head he produced. Right.
Yeah.
And so, so now I at least knew that my $17,500 investment was worth probably $35,000, because babies were $25,000 a pair, and these were, sub-adults. But of course, I wasn't going to sell them, so I raised them up. And I don't breed a lot of ball pythons at 18 months, to be honest with you. But in this case, I did produce 4 eggs the following year from head to head. And I'll never forget, and I've been cutting snake eggs since Burmese pythons years and years before. So I remember pulling the clutch of eggs up at day like 56, which is right around, I usually cut between 56 and 58. I think I was really excited to do this at 56. And ironically enough, I had a guy named John Romeo, who was out in New York, that had contacted me because he knew I had eggs, and he said, I want to buy a male. Yeah. He said, if you produce a male, I'll pay $25,000 cash for it. So I mean, I'm like really stressing about this thing. It's a lot of money at that time, and ironically enough, dude, it was the same year I produced the albino black rat snake, the 2-headed albino black.
No way, really?
It was within like
crazy.
like 2 weeks. I had the 2-headed albino black rat snake and the clutch of pieds that were hatching. So I remember pulling these out of my incubator in the basement and putting them up on my kitchen countertop. And I remember I had like a little tiny mag flashlight, those pretty heavy but powerful mag flashlights. Why, I don't know. When I cut the eggs, I would use this flashlight to look inside, right? So I cut egg number 1, and it's a normal. I cut egg number 2, it's a normal. I cut egg number 3, it's a normal. I'm shaking now. I'm shaking like, because I'm like, my gosh, I have all this investment. Now these are 66% possible hets that are, no one's going to buy them, all this other stuff. And so sure enough, I'm cutting egg number 4, cut, open the flip. I got the light on it. It's a freaking pie.
So you see the white, right? That's the first thing you see.
50-50 white, man. And literally, I shit you not, I was shaking so bad, I dropped the flashlight onto the egg.
Oh my God,
Drop it onto the egg. Albumin goes flying everywhere. I'm immediately like, oh my God, did I kill the snake? I just killed a snake. It was fine. The snake was fine. It hatched out. I called John later that night. Said, dude, I've got a pied. I don't know if it's a male or female. He's like, just let me know. So a couple days later, it crawls out of the egg. It's a male. So as much as I wanted to keep that animal, the $25,000 was such a huge amount of money.
It's a come up, dude.
When you're 20 years old and you're starting your business and talk about an infusion of cash.
I mean, come on.
So I called John up and I said, yeah, if you want it, it's fine. So he literally flies out and is going to drive the snake back. So he flies out, rents a car, comes to my house, $25,000 in cash, not a check, cash money.
That's frigging ridiculous.
Picks up the snake, drives back. And I always kind of regretted, selling that snake. The money was too good not to, but it was a way for me to really. I mean, I put that money into investing in other snakes and growing my business and stuff like that. And ironically enough, we have a vlog coming that tells a story about the same year on the same countertop. Because for whatever reason, my kitchen countertop, I mean, what a way to freaking do it.
You guys want eggs and bacon?
I used to always take my snakes to the countertop to look at them. And that's like within a week or two of hatching the pied, on the exact same spot of the countertop, I opened the albino black rat clutch, and there's a 2-headed albino black rat snake that ultimately, if you guys, in the next day or so, you'll see a vlog about that. We talk about, 2-headed snakes and stuff like that, and I tell the story. But anyways, that's not what that's about. So John buys it, and ironically enough, he bred it in like 8 months.
Wow.
So he made a shit ton of money because hets were $25 a pair, and he produced. I mean, this male got up to size, bred in 8 months. Within a year, he had produced a whole shitload of hets, and he did really, really well with the project. And then the thing that was so great was, of course, like all projects, they go up and they come down. So pieds were coming down. So I think like 6 or 7 years later, John called me up and he sold me that male back for $5,000.
No
You know,
way.
so I
really?
bought that male back, and I had that male for 15, 18 years. You know,
Wow.
I mean, maybe even longer. I don't know. It was like my pet male. I mean, I bred it obviously, but so it was cool that it lived the majority of its life with me after producing it. So the point is that, and again, this was no bash on Pete at all, because like I said, I mean, I think Pete was just in no position at the time to want to do something for me. For he had just was overcoming a massive IBD where it wiped out almost all his bows. He probably lost millions of dollars. And like I said, it didn't affect our friendship. It didn't affect. This was the way it was. Did it suck? Would I have done that to somebody? No. And I've told people that experience really has dictated how I've dealt with a lot of customers over the last 30
I remember when I
years.
first started working here, you actually told me this story because of that. We were talking about customer service and stuff like that.
I've had people buy an animal, and 6 months later, the animal die, and 99% of the time, I'll replace the animal. 6 months later, obviously after 6 months, it's not my fault that an animal dies, but I knew how it felt, and it felt so bad that I've typically taken that path. That doesn't mean every time we're going to replace something after 6 months. I want people to be like, oh, I'm
going to buy it. Yeah, yep, died.
But most of the time, I want people to not feel the way I felt when I lost that snake, But it also kind of, the reason I told this story, and then we'll jump into some super chats, is that I wanted to talk about the stick-to-itiveness, the perseverance, the fact that I could have just eaten that money and walked away from it, and just have to pay my stepdad back, or father-in-law back somehow. But instead, I rolled the dice again, and that dice roll, made me that money back. And by the way, made other PIEDs down the road too. I mean, that was the first PIED I produced, but I produced many more PIEDs from that pair down the road too. So it turned out to be a really great investment. And
sometimes you got to take that big risk, and maybe another bigger risk, even if it feels uncomfortable, to do something that's a little bit more, impressive.
And I think that's been kind of the tale of my career, to be totally honest with you, is typically, there's very few things. It's weirdly enough, I don't know why this is the case, but it's weird that haven't been a lot of things that myself and Lori have done that have been successful right off the rip. Usually it's been kind of like, try it, fail, try again, succeed, or maybe try again 3 times.
Fix.
And that's usually how my career has went. It's kind of been like one step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps back. It's like that's kind of how it goes, and they just want to let you go.
Damn, son.
Can we rail this in?